Шановні учасники круглого столу, хто змог бути з нами сьогодні
Dear
фізично,
Roundtable participants, those who are with us on site, those who are online, good morning. Today, the Center for Policy and Legal Reform is holding a roundtable about reducing the negative impact of oligarchs on political processes in terms of state building. And we are going to present our strategic vision of preventing such negative influence. And also we are going to look at disciplinary liability for corruption in terms of legislative regulation, and also we're going to look at the practical aspect. Thank you again to the National Democratic Institute, which has been supporting the project of Center for Policy and Legal Reform for the second year now. That has to do with the development of democracy during the war, particularly during the full-scale invasion. So I would like us to commemorate the defenders of Ukraine who gave up their lives for the development of democracy in our country. A moment of silence, please.
Дякую. Продовжуємо нашу роботу. Мене звати
We are moving forward with our work. My name is Yulia Kirichenko. I am a member of the board of the Center for Policy and Legal Reform, leader of the constitutional vector, and today I have the honor of moderating the discussion that has to do with our other focus area in the Center for Policy and Legal Reform, which is the anti-corruption area. Reputable Mr. Havranyuk. Thank you again to the National Democratic Institute, particularly its director Marcin Walewski, who had been supporting Ukraine for many years and putting his personal and expert effort into the development of our country. And also NDI is currently helping us with conducting our research, which I'm sure will contribute to democracy. By the way, thank you, colleagues, for your work. I hope state institutions will hear them. And I hope that as part of our European integration track, we will be able to implement the transformative policy that will reduce the impact of oligarchs. We are not saying that there should be no oligarchs as a phenomenon. It is a normal phenomenon that exists in every country, but we have to reduce their impact on the state building processes, because otherwise we will probably not be able to become part of the European Union. And we are convinced that this is the only path that we can take to ensure our survival as a country, in addition to the armed forces, of course. And I want to point out that our work is going to go as follows. We'll have presentations by Mykola Havranyuk and Olga Piskunova. We will have a presentation of the Deoligarchization Strategy, and then we will present an analytical study which is about disciplinary liability in the sector of corruption. Like I said, the legislative and practical aspects are both very interesting. There is definitely some food for thought here. Thank you again to colleagues who are online. I think after the presentation, we will have some time to discuss it. So please do raise your hands. I don't think we are a lot of people. I think we will have time for everyone to speak and we will have a fruitful discussion. So let's move forward to the main part. We have Mykola Havranyuk, Director for Scholarly Development of the Center for Policy and Legal Reform. For the purposes of this event, it's important that he leads the anti-corruption vector in our organization. So over to you. Thank you, Julia. I would like to start by saying that recently we have often heard messages that we are forced to fight against corruption, that this is some external factor. That is not true, because this is our own obligation. And it is this obligation to overcome oligarchs and corruption that was one of the pledges of the current president and the current public authorities. We signed agreements where they committed to this, so we just have to fulfill our commitments. So why do we need a deoligarchization strategy? You will hear more about it from Olga Piskunova today, but I would like to point out 3 points. First, there is a clear opinion of the Venice Commission. We approached the Venice Commission by ourselves. Nobody forces us to do that, just to highlight this. The Venice Commission said clearly that you need to fight oligarchs and their impact by means of systemic comprehensive measures rather than just formalized procedures. The law against oligarchs adopted in 2021 is declarative in itself. It is not enforceable, and we have already observed it in practice. We have seen that despite everything that is written in that law, the authorities fight against oligarchs, well, the way they do. One is ousted, another one is under investigation, the third one is, I don't know, elsewhere, and so on. There is also a plan of events regarding the prevention of abuse of influence by oligarchs. This plan is suspended by the end of martial law, and it includes only 20 measures, most of which are rather vague. In the draft strategy of deoligarchization that we are working on, there are 93 indicators or activities. And if we look at them in more detail, we probably will exceed 100 as a count. There are 3 well-known facts regarding the law about oligarchs. I have mentioned them multiple times. This law includes certain prohibitions, certain commitments, but we know that these prohibitions are not enforceable, neither are the commitments. I'm going to speak about disciplinary or political liability later. There is no disciplinary liability, unfortunately. It is not regulated in any way, and thus there is no liability for violating the requirements of this law. Some other activities that are included in this law, such as prohibition financing political parties or prohibition to engage in large privatization. These are just the isolated measures that have to be accompanied by other provisions. That is why the Venice Commission points out how important it is to engage in a comprehensive approach. A year ago, we presented this comprehensive approach in the White Book of the Anti-Oligarch Reform. Those who are interested have already seen that. Also, the Venice Commission mentioned that there should be activities of personal nature taken against oligarchs, which have to accompany the systemic approach, should be developed with full respect for the rule of law. which means that there should be very clear legal identifications of an oligarch. There have to be clear guarantees of independence of the decision maker. And there has to be due legal procedure. What is due legal procedure? In a democratic system, this is always a court procedure, first of all. So in our draft strategy, we have identified this set of measures, and we are proposing how to implement it. Also, in our strategy and in our draft law, we propose to identify the characteristics of an oligarch more clearly, which is one of our strategic goals. And the third item is that we want to supplement this comprehensive approach in the form of criminal liability of certain individuals for certain actions. This is also a strategic goal, and I will speak about it more later. Also, we believe it is important to ensure due legal guarantees and to remove all the other provisions of the law against oligarchs. At one of the roundtables, we heard the suggestion to abolish this law completely. But if we do that, we will have to add the characteristics of an oligarch to the criminal code, and that is inconvenient. In any other context, we don't really need the characteristics of an oligarch. So how should we change the definition of who an oligarch is? We suggest changing the level of assets that and economic entities that should be controlled by an individual to have the oligarch status. If
багатство схоже на олігарха. Друге, ми удосконалюємо ознаку таку, як участь у політичному житті, і робимо ці
150 million, this is already a level at which a person can be considered an oligarch. If we speak about influence on the media and the fact that an individual is the ultimate beneficial owner, it is either or. So one of these characteristics is the third characteristic. Something that we figured out at the previous discussion is that contemporary oligarchs often specialize in the media sector, gambling, cryptocurrencies, which cannot be considered a classic monopoly of sorts. So as for the characteristic that somebody is involved in political life, we try to specify it as much as possible. So that if the court has a person in front of them, they can understand for sure whether this includes involvement in political life or not. As for supplements to the comprehensive approach, what we meant was amending some articles of the criminal code, namely articles that define crimes typically committed by oligarchs, to add this qualifying characteristic that a certain action, if it is committed by an oligarch or a public official with an especially responsible position, because this can also be an individual working in the interests of an oligarch. In addition, actions of persons acting in the interests of oligarchs, they can be considered abetting or another form of association under the criminal code. We should also keep in mind the measures that can be used in relation to legal entities, which also needs to be included in the criminal code. Here is what can be committed by an oligarch or a public official, and if we as this qualifying factor, this situation could be changed dramatically. What are the new articles of the criminal code that I was talking about? Anti-competitive coordinated actions of economic entities, deceiving regarding the structure of a media entity, and also articles that are overdue in the criminal code. As for the due legal procedure, of course, it is a court procedure. All these characteristics of crime should be proved in the pursuant to the procedure identified in the criminal procedure code. The investigative purview belongs to the NABU, the prosecution goes to SAPO, and thus the relevant court is the High Anti-Corruption Court. Thus, we could use the same anti-corruption structure to fight against oligarchs that we created to fight against top-level corruption. Another point, where are Ukrainian oligarchs born? In the administration of the president, and this is a well-known fact. Mr. Kuchma generated them, but he did not kill them. And we define this as one of our strategic priorities, to clearly identify the legal status and requirements to the formation of agencies and individuals that ensures the activity of public authorities. There has to be a relevant law, such agencies have to be formed. But before this is done, we have to reimagine the role of these agencies. We have to audit their activities and property that they govern, which I'm going to talk about a bit more now. As part of this project, we hesitated whether we should develop a law on the president of Ukraine that Ukrainian legal scholars and politicians have been talking about, or whether it should be a law on the auxiliary agencies and services to the president of Ukraine. We decided that it should be the latter. This is the proposed structure that you see on the screen. So far, it is not entirely ready so that it can be adopted. We understood, based on the response of parliamentary MPs, that those who are in opposition now are also not ready to vote for this law, because they want to join the authorities and use the same opportunities and benefits that they can enjoy thanks to the office of the president. I want to mention the words of a famous Ukrainian scholar, Vadim Avrayanov, that the purpose of state governance in post-socialist countries is not improving the existing system, but destroying it and building a better one. And we have several examples in front of us. I provided the examples of Lithuania and Poland. The law on the president of the Lithuanian Republic that regulates the activity of the chancellor. It is the only auxiliary agency of the president, and the chancellor of the chancellery is a public official. So it is an accountable individual. As for the example of Poland, under the constitution, the only auxiliary is the chancellery of the president of Poland. And there is even an exhaustive list of property, the cars, the building of the chancellor, and 2 residencies. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because in Ukraine we have a lot of auxiliary agencies and services of the president. For the most part, they have nothing to do with the powers of the president defined by the law. You see that there is interaction with Muslim countries, support of education, the large-scale construction. There are 49 such agencies, not one office of the president or chancellery of the president, but 49. And another item to discuss. One of these agencies provides the material and economic support of the president, but not only the president, but also the parliament, the cabinet of ministers, the Defense and Security Council, and other state agencies. Thus, all these agencies have a certain material and other dependence on the president and his inner circle, because in general, public administration is under the president. And through this governance, the president essentially is involved in some economic activity which is not characteristic of the position of a president at all. This includes resorts, children's camp, a construction enterprise, and even a spirits enterprise. It is difficult to change this, but there absolutely has to be a change, because this is an outrage situation, and we are we envisioned as our task to ensure political independence of the president and the other public agencies. Thank you. And I will be thankful for a discussion, but we will start it after the second presentation by Olga Piskunova.
Thank you, Mykola. Thank you for the systematic approach and being brave enough to talk about these issues, because these issues are not often raised, though people talk about at the end. Now I would like to give the floor to the expert of the Center of Political and Legal Reform, who makes a lot of effort in this area, and she is a member of the Public Integrity Council. So Olga Piskunova, over to you. Thank you. So Mykola has already been speaking quite a lot about some strategic goals that we have in our de-oligarchization strategy. So this is how we call it, because the legal title of the document would be quite long, and so you have heard what happened before the development of this strategy. There is a range of problems that we see, and international partners of Ukraine ask from time to time, and they say that the Venice Commission, they made their opinion public. So what is going to happen next? How are we going to take it into account and implement it? So our strategy was actually aimed at taking into consideration all the recommendations of the Venice Commission. And I would like to remind you that in their opinion, the Venice Commission, they talk about two approaches to be used by Ukraine for the oligarchization. The first one is the personal approach. It is contained in the anti-oligarch law, and as Mykola said, it defines the criteria on which individuals are recognized as oligarchs, the procedure, and the limitations and sanctions to people who are recognized as oligarchs. And the paradox of this approach, as pointed out by the Venice Commission, is that implementation of personal sanctions against oligarchs requires quite a lot of steps to be taken by the relevant bodies to implement sanctions. And if state authorities and judicial systems, they are influenced by oligarchs, in this case, sanctions will not be effective, or they will be very selective and they will not be necessary effect. Also, the Venice Commission offers a more systematic approach as opposed to the personal approach. And according to the conclusion of the Venice Commission, such a systemic approach should contain the continuation of the structural reform of the judicial system, which is going on. And just yesterday, some aspects of these reforms were actually threatened because of the decision, the ruling of the higher court. And also the next element is effective anti-monopoly policy, which should also influence the recovery of economy after the victory of Ukraine. So the Venice Commission underlines that the measures to counter corruption should be strengthened. And here also, we are talking about further steps and measures in the area of lobbying and transparent public decision making. So there was a law on lobbying, and now there is a draft of the ethical rules of lobbying, and the transparency register is in the process of consideration. So this concept, it actually was created within the oligarchization approach. So the next component here would be the transparency of public procurement. Today we have like partly a public approach to the ProZorro system, and procurement announcements are published there, but we see that there are still issues with the transparency of public procurement, and we need to address them. So the next component is strengthening the media pluralism, and here we can say that it is not just a wish of the society in Ukraine, but also it is requirement or desire of the European partners. So that is to stop this United Marathon, which kind of monopolizes the information space in Ukraine, considering that this marathon still has a huge audience of people who watch it. And another problem related to this marathon is that there are 3 oligarch-owned channels which are funded now from the state budget. Because they participate in this United Marathon. So here we can say that those oligarch-owned channels, they are supported from the money of the taxpayers. And also the Venice Commission suggests to strengthen the anti-money laundering measures. So this topic lacks public discussion as of now, and probably in Ukraine, not a lot of attention is paid to this issue, but this issue does exist, and now we see some non-public discussions about how the money which was moved like from Ukraine abroad should be brought back. And also the next element is enhancing the rules on funding of political parties and elections. So this is something that we need to focus on now, because after the martial law is over, there will be no time to improve relevant legislation, because the political processes will start like to to prepare for the elections now, because now they are on stop. And one of the elements that the Venice Commission is focusing on, in their opinion, is the taxation, tax legislation reform. So all these elements have been included into our de-oligarchization strategy. So its full name would be a strategy to overcome the threats related to the excessive influence of individuals having a significant economic and political impact in a society, oligarchs. So it contains 5 sections. So general provisions, there we see the description of the strategy, like why it is offered, what it contains. There are general principles on which the strategy has been developed. Section 2 is analysis or a review of the current situation, where the current state of affairs is analyzed, like what is happening in Ukraine, and also there is a review of the international requirements to Ukraine in the context of Euro integration in particular, and analysis of the risks in this regard. So section 3 is the biggest. It contains 26 strategic goals in 8 areas. And those are the areas that we defined based on the Venice Commission, related to the systematic approach. And here we talk about the regulatory area, like to improve current laws in terms of economy, law enforcement, customs control, and other aspects. And also in this subsection, we offered to define the legal status and the requirements to the auxiliary bodies to ensure the operation of the state authorities, including office of the president. Here we also see some provisions on lobbying rules and decision making. The next area is elections and political parties. Here we suggest to define the system to finance political parties, to ensure independence of the Central Election Committee, and to make sure that people have like independence when they are responsible for the election process. And another strategic goal is to ensure the mechanisms on how to terminate registration of inactive, like so-called dead political parties, which were registered before by oligarchs to achieve their strategic goals. So the next sphere would be state governance and administration. So here we're talking about the governance and administrative procedures, because we see that there is some automation and digitalization in the provision of administrative services. It allows to reduce the risks of corruption. Also, here there are provisions on the reform of the state tax service and the customs office. We think that those areas are most problematic as of today, and the results of the opinion surveys which were held recently show that according to people and businesses, these spheres are most most affected by corruption risks. And also there is such as an area as finance, economy, anti-monopoly, and assets management. So this is what Mikola was talking about before. Also, here we talk about the effective system to avoid monopoly situation. So there are provisions on anti-monopoly committee so that the relevant law is in compliance with the relevant requirements, and so that there are certain anti-corruption provisions for people to be elected in this body, and also there are some provisions on privatization of state and municipal assets, and this is what we stated in the white book, that many enterprises which are monopolies today, they were became privatized in the first years of independence of Ukraine. So they were in the hands of oligarchs, and there were some manipulative schemes used for that. So the government lost a lot of money because of these schemes. And in the subsection, we also suggest a strategic goal to create favorable conditions to develop competitive business, in particular big business. And the next area is corruption prevention and countering corruption. So this is a focus of the Venice Commission, and also this is a topic of public discussion in Ukraine and beyond. And here we want to clearly define the legal liability for corruption to enhance the efficiency of anti-corruption activities at the highest level. And we think that those are the key strategic goals which need to be implemented as a priority. So the next area is law enforcement and judiciary. And the Venice Commission is also focusing on this area, and we suggest to finalize the formation of relevant law enforcement and judiciary bodies, which would be really independent, and also how to ensure real independence of the Economic Security Bureau and other bodies, because the activities of these agencies, they relate to dealing with oligarchs. The next area, number 7, is media. So we say that today not all media are independent, and there is in some instances influence from oligarchs, but we have to say that every year we have more and more really independent media. And another strategic goal is to create a high level and to build a high level of media literacy among people, so it will help to also counter propaganda, counter some fake news, and achieving the strategic goal would help to prevent the influence on citizens during elections as well. And another sphere is international relations. Here we have one strategic goal. We suggest to have an effective cooperation between Ukraine and the European Union on preventing trans-border crimes and influence of oligarchs, and so that there are effective mechanisms on how to bring back money.
And 2 more sections, there are mechanisms of accomplishing strategic goals that I mentioned, as well as monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of the strategy. Here we envision that based on this strategy, there can be 2 4-year or 5-year implementation plans for the strategy, and each of the strategic goals will be distributed into specific steps to accomplish it. In order to put it together with what was suggested by the Venice Commission, the green tick shows the recommendations of the Venice Commissions that were fully included in our draft deoligarchization strategy. This includes the judicial reform, anti-monopoly reform, activities to prevent and fight against corruption, reinforcing the activities to fight against money laundering, in strengthening the rules of political financing of parties and elections, and reform of tax legislation. Also, our strategy partially takes into the pluralism of media and transparency of public procurement, because we believe that compared to the other areas, these two are less problematic. That's it from me. Thank you for your attention, and I encourage you to discuss the draft and the problems that were brought up in the conclusion of the Venice Commission and our draft strategy. Thank you, Alla. Thank you for the presentation. Please let us see the online participants on the screen. Thank you. I see you. We are starting a moderated discussion. Colleagues, maybe somebody would like to mention something on site. Andrei Klimasyuk, please. We have a broadcast. Please introduce yourself. Andrei Klimasyuk, Head of Projects, Institute of Legislative Ideas. First of all, thank you to the Center of Policy and Legal Reform for this comprehensive work. This is not the first event dedicated to the subject, and we see that indeed a lot of highly important work is being done. And if such activities and mechanisms are implemented, Ukraine will see long-term development indeed. These steps have to be implemented for sure. At the Institute of Legislative Ideas, when the draft law and then law was adopted, we criticized it. We did mention it was not going to work this way. We did say that the issue had to be considered comprehensively, activities had to be comprehensive, while isolated regulation would definitely not be effective. However, the full-scale invasion started, and obviously the implementation of this law was suspended anyway, like the speaker has mentioned, but the work goes on. I would like to point out on probably a different highlight, but this is something that I'm personally interested in. This is an acute subject, I guess, which is the influence of Russian oligarchs, in particular, on the Ukrainian economy. After the full-scale invasion, there was this Pandora box that was opened, and we saw that Russian oligarchs indeed have a large impact on the Ukrainian economy. We see that at extractive enterprises, for instance, that there is a large share of Russians, especially Russian oligarchs. Ukraine started gradually cleansing its economy thanks to the mechanism of using sanctions in the form of asset seizure in particular, but the share of Russian oligarchs in our economy is definitely present. So my question in relation to this is whether the mechanisms that you proposed can be applicable to fight against the excessive influence of external oligarchs, or should there be some special mechanisms that would enable us to reduce the excessive impact of foreign oligarchs, Russian or otherwise? They can have different goals. They can work in the interest of various parties. So I'm interested in your opinion. Thank you, Andriy. Mykola? Yes, I will respond to the question. Andriy, in your question, you had a slight hint of the answer because foreign oligarchs, especially Russian ones, maybe some Belarusian ones or Iranian, they are different to ours. We cannot apply sanctions to ours unless they are connected with terrorist activities. As for Russian ones, yes, it can absolutely be done. So, of course, we have to strengthen the sanction regime. We have to provide criminal liability for evasion of sanctions, other actions used to circumvent sanctions or finding loopholes. This is the first step that I see in this context. As for everything else, when we look at the deoligarchization strategy, it can also be applied to Russian oligarchs with certain exceptions. In order to see what those exceptions are, we should analyze the draft strategy itself. I will follow up here slightly. In the white book, we analyzed the experience of other countries, and in particular, we analyzed countries which have significant impact of Russian oligarchs, Baltic countries, Georgia, Moldova. And here we can also look at successful experience, especially of Baltic countries, of how they reduced the impact of Russian oligarchs on their economy and politics. Today, we can also take into account the experience of Georgia, where we see a certain rollback due to the excessive influence of oligarchs that have strong ties to Russia. But the general conclusion in our white book is that the impact of Russian oligarchs is indeed destructive. And countries where this impact is quite strong, it is most difficult for them to build a democratic society, democratic institutions, and their way to overcome this crisis, economic and political, is much longer than that of countries that were able to remove Russian oligarchs from their personal space. Thank you, Alha. I will add that it indeed complicates European integration, which is vital for us. Colleagues, those who are on site here, maybe you would like to continue. Hello, thank you for your presentation, but do introduce yourself, please. Julia, National Agency for Corruption Prevention. I verify reports of political parties now, and I have a question in relation to this. You mentioned that you have an idea regarding additional measures to restrict the financing of political parties. For example, Article 15 limits contributions to these parties. And when it comes to individuals with significant economic influence, we have it in relation to individuals who are recognized as such, and we don't have this register, so it becomes a bit controversial here and contradicts itself somewhat. I wanted to ask you how we can fight against these dead parties, so to speak, because this is a register maintained by the Ministry of Justice. I also want to say that we have a question not about the dead parties themselves, but their local organizations mostly. They have the main central party, which may not necessarily know that at some point they had a certain local organization. How do we fight against it? Maybe you have an answer to this question, because we will have to answer this question as well. And as for additional measures on restricting funding for political parties, if the colleagues don't mind, since I am an expert in constitutional issues. I will provide my own position regarding dead parties and their local organizations. I will say that this is the new version of the law on political parties that has been in development since 2019. There was quite an inclusive working group in the parliament headed by MP Victoria Podgorna. There is an opinion of the Venice Commission and the OSCE people, but so far it has not been registered in the parliament. Still, we expect this will be done in this convocation of the parliament. And of course, the new version of the law does provide a certain answer to the question what should be done with political parties and they are absolutely isolated local organizations. And our position is that there has to be an extended list of cancelled registrations of political parties and the practical implementation of such provisions. We know that the Ministry of Justice can file a lawsuit to the court to cancel the registration of political parties if they don't participate in the elections for a certain time. We had cases like this, but there was no systemic approach that we saw from the Ministry of Justice to bring the register in line with political parties. If you Google buy a party, you will see how much it costs, and that shouldn't be like that, but everybody knows how it works. We have another approach in the new version, which is to cancel registration if the party fails to file a financing report or files empty reports to you, to the National Agency on Corruption Prevention. For example, if during we'll propose a different reporting period here. But for example, if the party doesn't file reports or files empty reports for a year, the NACP informs the Ministry of Justice about it, and on this basis, the Ministry of Justice goes to court and cancels the registration. This is another reason that we suggested, colleagues. I will just add that we proposed an option of further independent financing of political parties. This could be implemented at the level of the tax code, the law on political parties, to grant citizens the right to identify which political party they want to support, and thus, based on their decisions, to provide part of the citizens' taxes to the support of political parties.
Самі партії можуть бачити певний вимір своїх
So, of course,
рейтингів.
this should not be a big percentage. It should be quite low, but then the political parties, they would see the effectiveness of their work. But of course, there are certain risks here for the state, but these risks, they can be mitigated via regulations with the relevant procedures. Thank you, Olga. Maybe I could add, as for the limitations of the contributions, the working group suggested a new limit from the experience of the Baltic states, when a contribution of a private individual would be limited to a certain percentage in the real income of the person within the last years, because you know that many money is contributed by oligarchs through fake persons who are considered to be contributors. So we suggested that if there is For example, a teacher from like in a village makes a big contribution to support the political party. So that is not realistic if their salary is quite low. So this is something that we would like to avoid, so that these people are used by oligarchs. And I would like to add, in the context of the criminal law, about this limited contributions, it is really strange because it is known that oligarchs they influence political parties and their representatives through whom they influence the policy, but there is no relevant qualification ground in the criminal code. And if we had such grounds defined, we could have already some cases against oligarchs. Now, because of course they are able to hire the best assistants, lawyers, economists, etc., and they can come up with different ways to put money to support their parties. If such bodies as NABU would monitor this situation, I think it would make it impossible for oligarchs to do that. About the percentage of the income, as a limit of contribution, we had these discussions as well, and there were some questions about that. But when there is an inspection of contributors, it needs a lot of time and effort, because here there is certain interference into the individual rights of people, because there are a lot of people who make contributions, and you need to actually check everyone who makes contribution. Would it not create a kind of a burden for people, and also there's inspections of people who would really like to support parties with their contribution? So do you think that this measure would be democratic? Because we are going to actually check everyone who makes a contribution to support a political party, because of course people, they understand that they do something to support a certain political party that they like, but it would be a certain burden for them if they know that there is going to be an inspection or a check on them. So we think that this mechanism could be used for certain goals by people who do that. And about this percentage from tax that could be paid to support the political party, we discussed, and we think that people pay taxes, and if there is state funding of political parties, so this funding comes from taxes also. And we see that now parties can get state funding if they get 5% during the elections. We thought that it could be 2%. Like even if a party got 2% at the elections, they could also get state funding. So do you think we could talk about some percentages here? Thank you, Julia. So you touched upon some broader questions about state funding of political parties. If you remember, on the 1st of July, a reform was launched against excessive influence of oligarchs on political parties, and thanks God we were able to have state funding. And you remember that as for those political parties who did not get to the parliament because they got not 5% but at least 2% at the elections, so we thought that they could get state funding, but it never happened. And the new version of the law on political parties would go back to the concept that we had, and it suggests to have state funding also for for those political parties who got 2% of the elections, and of course those parties who are not in the parliament, they support it. Those who are in the parliament, they do not really support it. But politicians here say that in our realities, we should have given money to the parties like so we would also be obliged to give money to the parties which were prohibited because they were anti-Ukrainian. So that could happen because here we need to think about an effective mechanism on how to prohibit anti-Ukrainian parties so that we don't fund parties which support the aggressor country. Another aspect that I wanted to mention is that when the state supports political parties financially, or citizens or separate individuals, they do not feel that they support this or that party because, yes, they pay money as taxes, but this money goes somewhere. This money from taxes, they are used to support like all political parties which are in the parliament. But what we are talking about is to give an opportunity to each taxpayer to define that they would like to use a certain percentage of their income and use this money to support a certain political party. And maybe not just a political party, they could also support a faith-based organization, an NGO, and then the person would feel that they paid, for example, 15% of taxes, and in this 15%, 1.5% they can use to support a political party, for instance, and they would feel that they really make this decision. This is how it works in Germany and in other countries as well. So let us move forward. We have also colleagues online. Maybe you have some comments, or those who are here with us face to face. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question in the online format in Zoom, please raise your hand so that I can see you, that you would like to join the discussion. I will give you some time and we'll wait. Our colleagues in Zoom, would anybody like to ask a question or take part in the discussion? Maybe you would like to comment on something. If no, then we can start the second part of our roundtable. So we were supposed to have a break, but I think that we can adjust our agenda a little bit. So now we can start our next session presentation of the result of the study of laws and practice on disciplinary liability for corruption and related violations. Thank you for giving me the floor. It would be good to have the slides on screen. Thank you. So from the title, you can see that there is this word that can almost not be seen. So I was thinking, like, should we say disciplinary liability or lack of disciplinary liability? Why I had these doubts, you will see from my presentation. So the report that has been developed contains 3 sections. Section 1 contains general provisions on the disciplinary liability. There are 9 subsections there, because without this, it is not possible to talk about the disciplinary liability of public officials, in particular for corruption and related violations. And in section 3, there are conclusions and recommendations. They take quite a lot of space, and they do not just exist as short conclusions, but they are actually a separate section. And also there are annexes, 8 of them. So number 8 is scientific publications on a disciplinary liability. So everything that has been published in Ukraine for the recent 30 years. I have looked through all the publications and articles and classified them if, depending on if they were related to the general provisions on disciplinary liability, or specifically like relating to judges or public officials or people in the military. So here it is possible to see what was the focus of this publication, and also in the annexes that there are examples of laws of other countries on the disciplinary liability. So here I have an example of Germany. This is what I really liked, and I used it as an example, as a sample that we can just put in front of ourselves and adapt it to adapt our legislation, at least partly, to this. And also there are abstracts in the format of tables from different laws and regulations of Ukraine on different subjects of disciplinary liability. So there are different categories such as sanctions, grounds, exceptions, like when disciplinary liability is happening, when it is not. And also there is a description of the procedures on making people, persons liable. And also I had a look at what happens in other countries with sanctions for disciplinary violations. So a bit of history, why we actually started working on this topic. I was one of the co-author of the law of Ukraine on countering corruption. It was long ago, in 1995, almost 30 years ago. And then we came up with quite a simple system that there is administrative liability for corruption, and there is this disciplinary liability. So administrative would be a fine, and disciplinary would be a person being fired from a certain post. So if an individual commits certain actions, there would be a fine and they would be fired. So this system existed for like 10 years, and people did not like it. Those who had the power, and President Kuchma were saying that he was countering corruption, he was creating some bodies, and he supported actually this law. This law was approved with his support, because then he was a young president, and he was trying to support some reforms. He was not always like consistent with it, but some MPs, such as Boris Bispali and Volodymyr Chernyak, who seemed quite progressive, but they did quite a bad thing. So they there was a draft law which was not relating to corruption, and they canceled this disciplinary liability.
And President Yushchenko, who was elected in 2005, a month or two after his election, signed this law. That was it. That's how it wrapped up. Any disciplinary liability or dismissal was over, and I will show the numbers later. The UN Convention Against Corruption speaks about the possibility and the necessity to apply disciplinary measures to individuals who commit corruption violations. And the law on corruption prevention hints that in situations when there is an administrative procedure or a criminal proceeding in connection with a corruption or corruption-related violation, for some reason was not dismissed from office or suspended, based on the court judgment, this should be done by the administration where the individual works. But for some reason, this provision isn't working. We also looked at a certain item in the anti-corruption strategy for 2021-2025, and the strategy, state anti-corruption program, and some other documents say that people should be dismissed from office if they are corrupt. This makes sense. This is understandable that an individual who steals something or who takes bribes in their position should be removed from that office as the biggest punishment so that they would be deprived of this opportunity. And we all know that in the labor code, it says that if a person commits embezzlement in their office, they are dismissed. It seems simple and logical. So we decided to check whether this disciplinary liability also works in connection with the fact that the law on oligarchs indicated that people who have ties to oligarchs should be brought to political liability. The real situation is as follows. Criminal corruption violations and corruption-related criminal violations have become much fewer in the last few years than, say, in 2021, about 1.5 times less. It's clear why. The war started, the law enforcement system is focusing on something else. In 2022, you see that there were over 1,300 individuals convicted for this, and in 2023, over 1,600. But they are mostly fined. Why? Because about 2/3 or 3/4 of these individuals are not officials. They are people who give bribes rather than receive them. So it is mostly a fine, sometimes community labor, and very rarely imprisonment. But as for an additional punishment in the form of prohibition to take certain positions, we see up to 239 people in 2022 and up to 220 in 2023. Clearly, when a person is convicted to imprisonment, they are obviously unable to stay in office. But you see, only about 4% of people are imprisoned. So the situation is that the absolute majority of people convicted for corruption stay in office. And even among those who are convicted for receiving undue benefit or embezzlement of public or municipal property and other things like that. As for administrative violation, the situation is even worse. We have about 1,000 people recognized liable. In 1 year, all of them are fined. The fines are quite low. On average, one person would pay 1,500 to 4,000 hryvnias, which is not a large amount for an individual who has an opportunity to steal or to be in a public position in a local self-government. Even 3,700 hryvnias is not a big amount. And only 0.2% were deprived of the opportunity to hold certain office. That's 3 people in 2022 and 2 people in 2023. This is a mockery of the very idea, it would seem. So, which of these individuals convicted for criminal violations and administrative violations are included to the Unified State Register of Corrupt Officials? We have about 1,000 in both on both slides, and we have 114 people in 2022 and 289 people in 2023, which is very few. As for the subject of disciplinary liability, I calculated there are exactly 40 categories of public officials to whom disciplinary liability does not apply, even though these officials are mentioned directly in Article 3 of the Law on Corruption Prevention. They are still not accountable to anyone, and thus there is no entity that could bring them to disciplinary liability. That's one reason. And the other reason is that they are partially political entities. So there is no reason, no point in bringing them to disciplinary liability, because as political entities, they should not be accountable to anyone, and nobody should influence them apart from political influence under the law. For instance, we can speak about suspending an MP by their voters. This is a political form of liability, or a parliament can issue a vote of no confidence to the government, and then there is a certain action that ensues. But disciplinary liability seems a little strange. At the same time, the law on the Cabinet of Ministers provides for such liability, at least for deputy ministers, leaders of central bodies of executive power. There are officials that are not political in terms of their appointment, but they still don't have managers that would be able to bring them to disciplinary liability. The secretary of the National Security and Defense Council or head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, they have somebody who appoints them. But the president of Ukraine does not have disciplinary powers because this is not provided for by the constitution. And there are some other officials on this list. So disciplinary liability for such individuals is absent in itself. There are also members of various commissions that are collegiate government agencies. There are commissions that are mentioned in the law on corruption prevention. There are those that are not mentioned.
Тут теж відсутня певна послідовність.
And here there is also a lack of this consistency. For instance, we look at the High Qualification Commission of Judges or the High Council of Justice. There is disciplinary liability provided for their members, although it is quite strange because they are the ones bringing themselves to disciplinary liability. I guess this doesn't happen a lot in life, but somehow they need to coordinate amongst themselves that this one will be brought to disciplinary liability, this one won't be. This is also a bit unnatural, it would seem, but similar to them, the Qualification Disciplinary Commission of Prosecutors has no disciplinary liability. And this also seems a bit inconsistent. There are also public officials that are not even mentioned in the law on corruption prevention, including the permanent representative of the president in the Crimea and his deputies, other representatives of the president in the constitutional court, in the parliament. The president can freely appoint them, not necessarily among MPs. They can be other individuals or the head of the state affairs office and their deputies and so on. There are also 15 categories of public officials to whom the law on public service does not apply, or disciplinary charters, and they can be brought to disciplinary liability in accordance with the labor code. As you remember, the labor code includes reprimand and dismissal. There are two categories here again, politicians and other officials. Again, this seems a bit unnatural as a bigger picture, that a politician can be brought to disciplinary liability for violations of some labor issues in accordance with the labor code. For instance, the politician is constantly late or drinks at work or something like that. It is hard for me to imagine this. So I guess there has to be some sort of order with all these issues, and we need to look at violations for which they can be brought to liability. Primarily, of course, these are violations of some ethical issues or violations that have to do with corruption prevention and so on. So in our research, we propose that if the labor code is the only thing that applies to these individuals, it should be included in the labor code that if these individuals abuse their office, abuse their powers for undue benefit, or the interest of other individuals, they should be dismissed because that is corruption. Or, for instance, if they accept the promise, commitment, or accept undue benefit, or if they waste property that does not belong to them, and so on. Clearly, they have to be dismissed for that. I analyzed the real situation on what ministers and deputy ministers were brought to disciplinary liability. For what? The phrasing is very strange, and the description of these violations is quite strange as well. They can be very narrow, very brief, or very extensive, for going to this place instead of this place, taking the wrong thing, and this is why they are punished. There is no such violation.
Ще одна проблема. У нас
Another problem is that in our country we have a lot of people who have certain offices in the patronage service. So we know that there are different consultants, advisors, assistants, and they are quite ambitious usually. They often actually have an influence on the person they are supposed to assist, but there is no clear legal definition of the actions and the status of these people. So these people who are assistants, consultants, and advisors, they are split into two categories. Just those who provide the assistance per se and the political assistance. So those are different categories, and in the legislation they should be defined in different ways. So also in the code of labor laws, it would be important to have some definitions, and for some categories of public officials, let me call them this way, I would bring back the provision of the anti-corruption law where they were mentioned, or maybe the law on public service could also stipulate some duties and responsibilities for them. And about the grounds for the disciplinary liability, there are some limitations in terms of the disciplinary liability in the Code of Criminal Procedure. So we analyzed all the laws and regulations, and we found just some provisions. So everything that we found, you can see here on the slide. Maybe we missed something, but it's most of it. So if there is the labor code. So the disciplinary liability is used according to the laws and regulations for the lack of declaration being submitted, for lack of notification in the judicial system. Also, there are violations by the judges of anti-corruption legislation, and also significant violations related to corruption. And what is the difference of violation and significant violations? That is hard to say, but this is how it is defined in the laws. Though also there are some violations for the prosecutors and for the staff members of NABU, and that is it. And thus we see that in most cases, committing corrupt act is not considered as requiring disciplinary liability. So in some cases, there is criminal liability. Provisions like used, also sometimes there is administrative liability, but rarely it is disciplinary liability, in particular due to the fact that the grounds are not defined properly. So thus we come to the idea that we would need to have a disciplinary code or statute for public officials, something which is close to the federal disciplinary statute of Germany, where there would be a list of disciplinary violations, what they mean. And I think that this is what is meant in Article 1 of the law of Ukraine on corruption prevention, and it says that there are certain grounds of disciplinary corruption-related violations. So this is not corruption. This is related to corruption, but it relates to what is described in the law, and it should be directly stated in the legislation. But this third element is currently missing. If we had it included in the legislation, it would be important to clearly define what are the grounds and what this disciplinary violation means. And we suggest the list of disciplinary corruption violations, 10 points, which could be a part of the disciplinary code. And another problem is that disciplinary liability, it can be combined with administrative and criminal liability. So this is quite traditional for our legal system, and this does not contradict to the Constitution of Ukraine, where it is stated that according to the non bis in idem principle, individuals cannot be held liable if they already have been brought to liability for the same violation. But if we are talking about the same type of liability, and here we're talking about different types of liability. And another thing, or probably even two issues that I wanted to state. In some laws, a violation is stated as a breaking the oath by the public official, and also there are some provisions on breaking the ethical behavior rules. But there's a question, what does it mean to break the oath? And because if we go to the definition of the oath, it is quite vague and not always clear how a person can be brought to liability for breaking the oath. And also the same goes for the ethical behavior. If we take a judge, for instance, the judge should act based on the law, on the legal state of judges, where the principles of their behavior are defined. Also, they need to comply with the regulations by the judicial authorities, and also they need to comply with anti-corruption law containing certain rules that they are obliged to follow. And based on this law, the state agency on a state service should develop the rules of ethical behavior for all persons defined in Article 3. So there are 4 different legal acts that a judge should comply with. And here I'm only talking about the national legislation. There are also some international pieces of legislation. So it is not always clear which rules a person should violate to be brought to this type of liability. And here I want to say that the grounds for the disciplinary liability should be defined very specifically and in detail. Another issue is that in our laws, traditionally, there are some very general phrases used, such as violating the work discipline, some actions which are inappropriate, like a lack of respect, and such wording, is used. When legislators look in the Constitution to define the grounds for the dismissal of judges, also we see that there are these words that are quite vague. If there were some more specific grounds and characteristics, then they could be used according to the practice existing in the country and in Europe, but we do not have that. Everywhere we have these vague definitions, and the practice lacks consistency. So, as it was mentioned last time when we had a roundtable discussion, we hear that it is not always possible to make a decision of the qualification and disciplinary commission of prosecutors because there are appeals brought against it in the judicial system, not to mention that many court decisions are cancelled. Another issue is that the Constitution requires to define the grounds for disciplinary liability based on the laws of Ukraine only. And scientists and academics, they say that maybe for minors or for some truck drivers or some other professions like that, it could be defined for what um, disciplinary liability could be used, and it could be in some like in some regulations, not always laws, but according to the Constitution, it should be in the laws. As for the sanctions, only in 3 current laws, we could see that there is a certain classification of the liability based on how severe this or that violation is. In one law, it is said that dismissal should not be used for certain types of violation, and in another law, there is a list of violations for which, for instance, certain reprimands can be used. And there is also a law, where there is a differentiation between minor and major violations. But in many of them, there is no classification, there is no kind of rating, and it is not specifically said what is a reprimand, for example, and there are differences in different laws, or for instance, a dismissal. It can be a dismissal from office from certain position, but not dismissal from service in general. So like for law enforcers, for example, they can be dismissed from office, but they can still work in the law enforcement system. But for the prosecutors, it is different. They would be dismissed and not work in the prosecution system at all. So it is important to have very specific definition, like what is notification, what is a reprimand, what types of reprimands can be used, etc. Also, we should not forget that disciplinary liability that is one thing, but there may be such a word as penalty, for example, and it is a different concept. And there are certain conditions that a person, for example, is not able to get a different position or a certain title in the military if they are have committed certain violation. And if something is related to corruption, then it also would influence the possibility of people to be part of the supervisory boards or some selective commissions, or possibility of individuals to participate in certain things. Because if people commit corruption related activities, even minor ones, they still would be influenced by this. And there is this concept of criminal record, and at some point it is invalid, but in corruption area it does not exist, that the person is in the corruption register. If the person is there, they are there forever. But it should not be like this, because we believe that people can change, and people have a right to be trusted, because we need to also respect people's dignity, and it was proved by the Constitution court in their decision on the lifelong sentence. But here we're talking about the lifelong sentence, and here we rather talk about disciplinary liability. Those are different things.
And to wrap up, I want to say that this report on disciplinary liability is quite large. So, of course, first we wanted to print out at least the conclusion, but there are 40 pages of conclusions there as well. And the report is in font 12, I think it's 230 pages now. So it is available on our website. You can find it there among publications, other publications of the Center, and also on the website of the Center for Policy and Legal Reform. You can easily find our today's project of the Deoligarchization Strategy and the draft law on amendments to the law against oligarchs. It is also quite large. The comparative table alone is 40 pages, and the strategy is 13 or 14 pages. It's a large text that you can read, of course. And if you find an opportunity, and if you find some contradictions or discrepancies, or if you feel like something should be added, please share. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to questions and discussions. Thank you, Mykola. I think you are a genius scholar, but it is a challenge for everyone else to read this volume of text. It is a significant challenge for everyone. I will not be able to read all of that, to be honest. I will read the conclusions, I think. But maybe you could create a short resume for like 3 pages. We are moving on to the discussion. Colleagues, of course, it's a bit of a joke, but indeed it is a bit of a challenge. And thank you for your systematic and comprehensive approach to analyzing disciplinary liability. Unfortunately, the conclusions are not very optimistic for Ukraine. There is hardly any disciplinary liability in South. It is not effective, and indeed, a person who has an opportunity to affect the budget through some powers, they remain in office and they pay a small fine, and that indeed seems like mockery, like you said. So I would like to thank you for taking on this comprehensive approach. Maybe we'll indeed approach a charter or disciplinary code at some point. And of course, I would hope that we could have legal certainty in that. I feel like I'm not a bad lawyer, but I would definitely have difficulty with applying these provisions if I had to, especially doing it in a unified, single manner. Colleagues, I will allow myself to move on to the discussion and to ask a question. Can we avoid subjectivity in this type of crime? Can we avoid evaluative judgments? Maybe you looked at foreign legislation.
Ми знаємо про те, що існує багато
We know that there are a lot of decisions of the European commissions related to Ukraine, and this has to do with the fact that courts tend to delay considerations. This takes years. During these years, people even manage to die without ever getting justice. So comparing our legal system to the legal system of France or Germany is impossible. In Western democratic legal systems, the court can take place very rapidly. It can take place on the day when the crime was committed, even. This is about some criminal violations. And it is known that the police brings the perpetrator to court, and there is a judge on duty who issues a decision. That there are decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, which said that there shouldn't be an absolute principle of legal certainty, that this principle cannot be accomplished only by preparing some perfect legislation, that it doesn't work that way. So, of course, we can have evaluative characteristics in the law, and the European Court of Human Rights said that these evaluative judgments would not contradict the principle of legal certainty. If a person can approach a lawyer, another expert, and the expert will provide their explanation, and the person will say, okay, that's clear to me now. And the law will not consider this undefined, uncertain. There is also a decision of the European Court of Human Rights where the court says that such definitions can be compensated by case law. But going back to case law, when it has developed in Ukraine over the years, it's contradictory when we see that there are judicial panels. There is one chamber, then another chamber, then the grand chamber. This all takes time, and everyone is waiting for this all to take place. It is very difficult to create a legal system under such conditions in a way that could be trusted. So wherever we can, to answer your question, we have to refrain from evaluative judgments, understanding that it is best to replace them with something more specific, if it is possible. Thank you, Mr. Havranyuk, and I will ask another question. We are now working on the ethics code of a Ukrainian MP. We have done the groundwork. The draft law is registered in the parliament. It has been there since the end of 22, but it is still there. So my question in terms of that is, do you think there can be disciplinary liability of MPs for ethical violations? Overall, it is a very complex, almost philosophical question whether legal responsibility can be applied for the violation of ethics. In our legal system, we reached point where we mixed up ethics and law and identified violations of some ethical rules as legal violations at the same time. And in many laws, it says that an ethical violation constitutes legal violation. But we are not speaking about the violation of ethics in general. We are speaking about official ethics, ethics in office. And in this case, you are speaking about a representative of a representative body.
І в цій ситуації, коли ми
In this situation,
говоримо про порушення етичних
in
правил,
addition to talking about violations of ethical rules, we also have the specific subject, a politician. Violation of ethics by a politician. Of course, in this case, we cannot speak about disciplinary liability in its classical form. We can speak about quasi-disciplinary liability because we have very specific characteristics of disciplinary liability. There has to be a violation, a criminal or an administrative one. It is considered pursuant to a certain procedure, and the sanctions for this violation are sanctions that are akin to disciplinary sanctions. But in what way are they similar to disciplinary sanctions? It is about external characteristics. Can an MP be reprimanded? Yes. The Polish experience demonstrates that, well, quite recently we read about this, that one of Polish leaders was punished by the highest disciplinary sanction that exists for MPs, which is a reprimand. What other sanctions can be used to members of the parliament? A fine? Well, I think there cannot be a very clear use of fines, but there are still financial sanctions applied to our MPs by depriving them of bonuses for failing to attend meetings. It does look like disciplinary liability. There can also be a prohibition to attend meetings. If it is prohibition, it is about restricting certain rights. This is a political right, but a legal right at the same time. And thus, this prohibition also is similar to disciplinary liability. And in my report, I am saying that I did dedicate a few pages to MPs and members of councils. I analyzed the European recommendations, the international examples, and I said that in different countries, it works in different ways and works differently in relation to MPs and local council members, because MPs works permanently, local councillors do not. We do need to pay attention to this, of course. But when I'm talking about the disciplinary code, of course, I do not envision MPs being included there as well. Thank you for your response. I especially like the point about a few pages. I will read something after all. Colleagues, please join the discussion. Andrei, please. Reklamasuk, Institute of Legislative Ideas. My question is as follows. When we speak about liability and about disciplinary liability in particular, it immediately occurs to me that there could be cases like this. Do you think that the mechanism of bringing somebody to liability for corruption and corruption-related violations can be used as a certain pressure in order to exert political influence on an official who is inconvenient for somebody who I think we had examples like this when leaders of anti-corruption infrastructure agencies encountered certain measures that could be considered pressure. And I think that such risks exist indeed. How do you think we can fight against such risks? How can we prevent that? Thank you.
Thank you for this question, Andrei. In my presentation, I actually admitted it. I decided not to focus on it because I did not think I will have time to talk about everything. So now there is such a problem that procedurally the disciplinary liability is not well defined. I compared in a table all the laws that define the procedure on imposing disciplinary liability, and there are different approaches in our different stages. In one law, there are 3 stages. In other, there are different number of stages. I'm talking about such laws as the law on public service, disciplinary status of police officers, the military, disciplinary statute, and other similar documents. So stages are defined in one document, not defined in other document. In some cases, there is a certain number of stages. In different law, there is a different number of stages, and also people who are involved are mentioned in different ways. So I think that it is important to have a system here and to clearly define in one law like the procedure, or there should be the same procedure described in all laws and regulations to make this procedure transparent and compliant with the legislation, so that every person held liable would have a chance to defend themselves with the tools available to everyone. Or if certain tools are not stipulated to anyone, then the person would not be able to use this approach, like not have, I don't know, 5 lawyers in court, for example. If it is possible to appeal for someone, then everyone should be able to appeal, or no one should be able to appeal. Like for judges now, for example, there is a disciplinary body, then the higher council of justice is considering it, but it's not happening for everyone. Not the same. Like for the military, for example, if there is some violation, then there are sanctions coming from the commander right away, and it's not possible to prove anyone later what happened. And there should be always a case created. This should be one of the stages. So the case should be filed, and the file should be kept for a certain period of time, so that it would be possible to go back and check if the procedure was complied with, and if the person appeals against disciplinary liability, so that it would be possible to check the facts. Colleagues, any other questions? Maybe our participants online have any comments or questions? Olga? Yes, I have a question. So in the law on prevention of corruption, in the section on liability, it is said that a person who committed corruption act or an act related to corruption, but if there are no penalties imposed on them, no other penalties are imposed on them, then they should be brought to the disciplinary liability. So can we say that here we see this mechanism to hold people liable, talking about disciplinary liability. So if there is no administrative liability, no criminal liability, then, for example, and the term is over for holding them liable in this sense, then there can be disciplinary liability used. That is a question of interpretation, actually, and if the legislator using this type of interpretation, like probably they meant, like legislators meant any types of situations that may happen when the person was exempt from criminal liability based on the grounds stipulated in the laws or exempt from administrative liability or penalties, and there was only a notification to the person, like if the person took like a bottle of something, for example, as a gift, but this bottle, it does not cost much, so it is a minor violation, and in this case it was decided to close the case. But here I want to mention what was in the slide. There is this draft law, I forgot the number, but it is already being considered in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, and there is an obligation there for the court to consider the relevant case, and it is possible to use disciplinary liability. And this Article 65 does not stipulate mandatory dismissal from office, because in some cases we need to take into consideration if a violation was minor, when it is possible to use some like reprimands or other penalties, but still there should be a certain liability used. Thank you, Mykola, our colleagues offline and online. Evgen Krapivin, Center of Political and Legal Reform. I have just a small comment. There were these provisions on in the slides on breaking the oath and breaking the ethical principles. So what can be done about that in this regard, and it is necessary to define if the corruption-related violations should be considered in this context. People often say, I have a short question, but then the short question requires a really long answer. I will try to be short and brief. So if we take, for example, the law on public service or the law on the status of judges, there are provisions on breaking the oath and breaking the ethical rules. And at the same time, there are other types of violations named there, which can also be interpreted as breaking the ethical rules or breaking the oath. So these two provisions, they are actually duplicating each other. And if we look at the practices, we can see that judges and prosecutors can be brought to disciplinary liability according to both provisions of the relevant article. And it is not correct, because here we see a situation when this principle is not complied with, that the person should not be held liable for the same act two times. And here I think that it is important to just have very specific categories of disciplinary violations, which would include all the components of possible violations in terms of breaking the oath or breaking some ethical rules. And in this way, we would also be able to avoid a situation when individuals are brought to disciplinary liability for any ethical violations, because there are quite a lot of like ethical provisions and ethical codes for judges or prosecutors. So there are some serious things there, like severe violations, such as abuse of office, for example. But also there are such things as, for instance, like when the person raises voice. So can it happen? If someone cannot hear me, I raise my voice, but someone then can tell me that I was yelling and that my behavior was not ethical. Or, for example, breaking the dress code. It is also about ethical rules, but if you read these rules, they are not always about ethics, but also about aesthetics. You know, if you're holding your knife and fork in the wrong way, it also may lead to some kind of liability, but of course it shouldn't happen. Thank you, Mikola. Yeah, so we had this situation when with breaking the oath, and there was this the president's decree when this judge of the constitutional judge of the constitutional court was dismissed. And the explanation was because of breaking the oath. There was no explanation. So the only problem was that this person was appointed by the previous president. Okay, so do we have any questions online? Maybe we have a gift for those who ask questions. Any questions or comments? I cannot see any questions, so then I will draw the conclusions probably, or Mikola, would you like? So, colleagues, I would like to thank the National Democratic Institute for this opportunity to have such a comprehensive studies, and I would like to say that we hope that we are not just talking about some analytical products, but that they will be also implemented in policy and in practice, and it will lead to the improvement of anti-corruption policies in the country, and they will facilitate your integration of Ukraine so that we can join and become the part of the European Union. And I wanted to say that we were able to hold this event with the support of the USA, through the support of generous support of American people coming from through USAID, with support of NDI, MPI, and IFAS. So thank you for being with us, and I hope you all have a nice day, and we will be hoping for the victory of Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Goodbye.